Panel 3, I call, and they're coming up as we speak, Karl Gershman, David Kramer, and this time I got it right with Ambassador Yakubashvili. Just sit down wherever. Okay. Our first speaker, David Kramer, joined the McCain Institute as Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy in 2014. Before that, he served as President of Freedom House for 4 years, where he also very much concentrated on Ukraine. He made several visits, quite a number of visits during that time. He was also Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and for 8 years served at the State Department from 2001 to 2008, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary with responsibilities for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, non-proliferation issues, and as Assistant Secretary of State for DRL, or Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in 2008. And I can't fail to add, during that time, he was a member of the State Department's representative on the Helsinki Commission, so I guess that made you my boss for about a year there, one of my bosses. Still recovering. And before joining the U.S. government, David held positions at the Project for the New American Century, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Ambassador Timuri Yakubashvili is a founder and president of the New International Leadership Institute. He was a Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund until fall of 2014. From 2011 to 2013, he served as ambassador of Georgia to the U.S. Prior to his posting, he was a deputy prime minister and state minister for reintegration in the government of Georgia. And before that, from 1990 to 2001, held various positions at Georgia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's displayed since then and is often spoken about and is a strong friend of Ukraine, if you will. And then our moderator, the panel will be moderated by Karl Gershman. He's the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, an institution with the mission to strengthen democratic institutions around the world through non-governmental efforts, and an institution which has provided considerable assistance to civil society in Ukraine for about 30 years now, because I believe they began even a little bit before the fall of the Soviet Union. The World Movement for Democracy, which was founded under his leadership in India in 1999, held its 5th Global Assembly in Kyiv in 2008. Prior to assuming the position with the endowment, Mr. Gershman was senior counselor to the U.S. representative to the UN.
Let's take the discussion in order of the way the title of the panel states it, from Budapest to Minsk and beyond. Those are 3 subjects. So let's start with Budapest. Let me say a couple of things, and then I want both David and Timuri to give their reflections on this. The Budapest memorandum, the agreement, like Minsk in a way, these are 2 very unhappy and unsuccessful agreements. They make Yalta seemed like a triumph of self-determination and democracy. Budapest, in December 5th, 1994, Ukraine gave up 1,900 nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, in exchange for security guarantees. 4-party accord, the 4 parties to the accord, Russia, Ukraine, U.S., and Great Britain, agreed to respect Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity, its sovereignty, in accordance with the principles of the CSCE Final Act, and they also agreed to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. Now, I want to invite both of the panelists to reflect on the issues of, I think the question answers itself, but let me ask it anyway. Have the parties to this accord honored their commitments, especially Russia and the United States? And what are the consequences of this if they haven't? Leonid Kuchma, who signed the agreement in 1994 on the 20th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum, said that Ukraine had been cheated in Budapest. And if that's true, what does that mean for U.S. credibility, which is already damaged when we didn't enforce the red line against Syria's use of chemical weapons in 2013? And, what implications does it have when you try to get a country like North Korea today, which, attaches a kind of existential significance to having nuclear weapons, when you try to get them to relinquish those weapons? So let me start with David, and then we'll turn to Timuri.
Carl, thanks very much, and Nadia, thank you and U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for putting this all-day event together. And I have to say, I'm really delighted to see so many people turning out today. So thanks very much for the opportunity, and it's great to be on a panel with two very good friends here, Carl and Timuri. I'm actually not going to reflect on Budapest Memorandum. I'm going to read it to you, because I actually think the text of the language speaks for itself. The United States, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm just going to read the first four points. So this is in exchange for Ukraine's agreement to give up its nuclear weapons, return them, or give them to the Russian Federation. And it says, point one, the United States of America, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the CSCE, the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which became the OSCE, final act to, and this is the key point, respect the independence and sovereignty in the existing borders of Ukraine. That's point one. Point two, the US, Russia, UK reaffirm their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. It says nothing, by the way, about nuclear weapons, as Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov claimed is the condition in his absurd press conference January 26th this year. Number three, US, Russia, UK reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the CSCE Final Act to refrain from economic coercion designed to subordinate their own interests to their own interests, the exercise by Ukraine of the rights inherent in its sovereignty, and thus to secure advantages of any kind. This has been going on long before 2013, Russia's violation of this condition of the Budapest Memorandum, with gas cutoffs starting in 2006, continuing into 2009, use of trade, many economic levers being deployed by Russia. Fourth condition, and the last one I'll refer to, the United States and Russia, UK reaffirm their commitment to seek immediate United Nations Security Council action to provide assistance to Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapons state party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Here's the key: if Ukraine should become a victim of an act of aggression or an object of a threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used. Nuclear weapons have not been used, they have been threatened. And yet nothing has been done in the UN context of this memorandum. Russia has been in violation of the memorandum not quite since the day it was signed, but certainly long before 2014's invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. The United States is a party to this memorandum, in my view, along with the United Kingdom, but I'm only going to talk about our country, has an extra obligation to provide support and defense for Ukraine, not to insert U.S. soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. No one in Ukraine has asked for that. And no one in this country is talking about that, despite the straw man argument that we hear from the White House. What Ukrainians have asked for, and yet the President of the United States has refused to provide, are defensive weapons to help Ukraine defend itself against further Russian aggression. The U.S. Congress, by huge bipartisan majorities, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, have all indicated they support providing lethal assistance to Ukraine. The person whose ultimate authority matters most, the President of the United States, is the one who has refused to do so, and I think he has proven to be deadly wrong.
Well, what does that mean? I posed two questions, and then we'll get to you, Timuri. What does that mean for U.S. credibility, and for, what implications does it have for our efforts to try to deal with a country like North Korea?
It undermines the credibility that we are not a reliable partner. Certainly, Ukraine is not a NATO member state, but the president, in the comments in The Atlantic by Jeffrey Goldberg, indicated he doesn't particularly view Ukraine as of importance to the United States. He views it as Russia's interest. He has essentially consigned Ukraine to a Russian sphere of influence. He's done the same with all the countries along Russia's borders. He's totally overlooked and undermined the concepts of sovereignty and territorial integrity. So we have not lived up to the Budapest Memorandum. We have undermined our credibility. We have damaged ourselves, and we have also set a dangerous precedent where it isn't just Russia that views our reaction as a lesson to be learned, but China, Iran, other countries in the world are also taking very careful notes.
But otherwise, you think we've done a fine job?
Terrific.
I say there are many Obama supporters in the audience. When I hear about the Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk Accord or Agreement, the first thing that comes to my mind is Vladimir Lenin. And there is a huge similarities between Budapest Memorandum, Minsk Accord Agreement, and Lenin. And similarity is very simple. They are dead and not buried. We can go back and forth with all sorts of linguistic acrobatics, what it means, how it can be interpreted. You can have millions of lawyers interpreting it for you. But the fact of the ground is that world order as we knew is over. It's gone. And it was gone by Russia occupying and annexing the territories of neighboring countries, directly or indirectly, like it happened in Georgia, like it happened in Ukraine. And last time, as I recall, when other country was trying to do the same, was severely punished. It was Saddam Hussein, who took part of the neighboring country and was then kicked out from there by military force. So when we are talking about the US credibility, what credibility? Where is it? The question is bigger. Is it the credibility of administration or the United States? And the surprising part for me personally in this famous interview in Atlantic was not what Obama thinks. I mean, we already figured it out a long time ago. But why he's saying it now? Usually presidents are saying those kind of things after they're out of the office, not still in the office. That's the scary part. And that scary part leads us to think and contemplate about where are we and what we are going to do. Because we see that Europe is preoccupied with a refugee crisis, terrorist attacks. We see that the United States is preoccupied with elections. We see that Russia is quite determined to move forward with aggressive moves. We see that Middle East is in fire, like it's something new. We see declining economically China and so-called BRIC countries. And there is a big question for countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Armenia. What are we going to do? It's a very serious question. What we've experienced, not only the Pax Americana, which is gone because of Russia's actions and inactions from the West, but also bad ideas coming from the West, and bad decisions coming from the West, and bad agreements coming from the West. Bad ideas, I mean, you can start from humanitarian aid to nation buildings, and we've seen so many bad ideas, and followed by bad actions. I don't go into details. And my favorite part on humanitarian aid is that Georgia suddenly after war became #1 per capita country in the world by number of the surgeon's gloves. We received the humanitarian aid, so we had so many these, elastic gloves that, we just still don't know what to do with it. But it counts as a humanitarian aid. I don't want to talk about nation building. You know all the stories around. Bad decisions, Minsk agreement is one of it. Not supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine, depriving Georgia and Ukraine membership action plan. And I can go on. So we live kind of a decade of bad ideas, bad decisions, and bad agreements. That all of that will have consequences. It doesn't matter who will be next US president or the next leader in Europe. Everybody have to face these consequences. Even more, we all believed, not me, that terrorism is originated in the Middle East because of Arab-Israeli conflict. The current terrorist attack in Brussels, which has absolutely nothing to do with Arabs or Israelis or Jews and the other Semites, indicates how wrong these ideas that were circulated are. Same applies to ideas about Ukraine, how wrong people are about Ukraine and why it's worthwhile to defend, or as they think, why it's not worthwhile to defend. The same bad ideas that you have to lift sanctions on Russia because, yes, but on the background of current events, probably it's not a good idea to have them in place. And don't underestimate this influence of these bad ideas that not only originate in the West, but very largely cultivated by Russian propaganda, supported by Russian propaganda, and disseminated by Russian propaganda very, very effectively, unfortunately, I have to admit. And one of the bad idea or bad consequence of this ideal thinking was what Russia wants. I heard so many times, including from the senior US officials and European officials, that Russians don't want war before we had war. I heard so many times that, in the end of the day, Russia is all about its own neighborhood, is not going to go out of the neighborhood, and suddenly we see Russia in Syria. And I can go on. So people talk about Russia employing this how do they call it? Hybrid warfare or something? Hybrid warfare, cyber hybrid, expeditionary, asymmetric. It's a classical warfare. In that classical warfare, starting from Sun Tzu to Thucydides to, Clausewitz, it was the same. But Russia does actually, I would call it voodoo warfare. He uses us as a voodoo dolls to punch needle, to perforate and harm Americans or Europeans. That's what they do. They are in kind of a black magic. And it's not about neighborhood that they have exclusive interests. It's about harming the same way the Western lifestyle as ISIS is trying to undermine Western lifestyle. For me, I don't see a difference. And don't tell me that they are not using bombs, then don't tell me they are not using, any other military means or terror. We've seen the photos of that terror today. So the big question now is that we can complain from today till the end of the US elections. It's not going to be helpful. Welcome to the real world. The real question is that what the countries around Russia and those who care about those countries should do. And I hope to find some answers in continuation.
Yeah, we have nothing but answers here. Okay. You went beyond Budapest, but I'm going to move on to Minsk. From one debt agreement to another. But Minsk is not buried. It's still, it's still in force. But, The Economist said it just a few weeks ago, not a single one of the agreements, not a single part of the agreement has been implemented. And the OSCE has said that there have been thousands of ceasefire violations. And just today I got this article. Maybe you guys are aware of it, but let me point out what it is. You aware of it? The Bild article? They uncovered some secret papers from the Donbass. The records of the Inter-Ministerial Commission for the Provision of humanitarian aid for the effective areas of the southeast regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. A meeting that was held 23rd of October 2015, which reveals what observers had long feared. The Russian government is steering all the affairs of the separatist areas in the east. They mention in the memo 4 members of the Russian FSB who were at that meeting. Interestingly, while there was a representative of Rinat Akhmetov at the meeting, there were no representatives of the separatist so-called governments of Luhansk and Donetsk. And the puppet politicians were only informed about the results of the meeting. And all of this document is confirmed as authentic by the newspaper. And they also have, these people reporting directly, this government reporting directly to Dmitry Kozak, the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. So, to get back to Minsk, why do we have Minsk? Is Minsk only there as a show where behind the curtains a separate plan for the controlled areas in the Donbass? This is the newspaper I'm reading from now, has been put into effect since the end of 1914, only 3 months after the signing of the peace plan in Minsk. And is Russia planning a permanent stabilization of the political, social, and economic situation in the Donbass under its control? A permanent stabilization that will make the Donbass a puppet state of the Russian Federation, whose future is set to be decided exclusively in Moscow. And this is confirmation, the paper notes, of the failure of the Minsk agreement, adherence to which by Russia is merely pretense. And one last point, the paper says, the West's demand that Ukraine should enable democratic elections in the areas not under its control, in other words, the area controlled by Moscow, is taken to the absurd by this revelation. The political figures up for election in such a vote would not be the ones in charge for the development of the area. Those that hold on to power are located in Moscow. Okay, so does this expose, speak about what this means, what Minsk means today? The agreement has not been broken. Poroshenko has talked about a referendum, which might lead to that. I mean, where are we headed with this? I mean, anybody want to say anything good about Minsk? Or if not, just think where we're headed. Is this agreement going to be terminated?
Well, it should be terminated, and you hear the refrain that Minsk is the only game we have. Well, we should come up with a new game. The problem with Minsk, well, there are many problems with Minsk. One is that the United States has not been involved. We have delegated responsibility for trying to resolve this crisis to the Germans and the French. I actually don't blame Chancellor Merkel. I think she is the glue to holding the EU together on sanctions. I think she has done the best she could under the circumstances, also given her own challenges at home as well as a coalition government. But one of the key problems with all efforts to address this crisis is we're treating the parties as equals. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine is the victim. The people in DNR and LNR are puppets of Russia. They're Russian-supported forces. They would not exist without Russian support. And there are Russian forces there, despite the repeated lies of Putin and Lavrov that there are no Russian forces there, although Putin slipped, if you remember, in December, saying that there were some people who went there. Then he said it was largely people on their own. It doesn't mention Crimea. It doesn't mention Russian forces. It talks about international forces. Russia is a signatory to this, but as you said, Carl, Russia has not fulfilled a single condition under Minsk, which includes withdrawal of forces, withdrawal of weapons, exchange of prisoners. That's why people still today talk about Nadia Savchenko and others who have been illegally captured, kidnapped by Russia, including from Ukrainian soil. So the issue of elections, I don't see how Poroshenko can get support in the Rada for what needs to happen. You look at what happened at the end of August last year, where 4 people were killed after a small bomb went off outside after the initial vote on this legislation. There is strong opposition to this. Frankly, I support the opposition to passing this legislation. It's none of Russia's business, whether Ukraine is a centralized, decentralized, federalized, confederalized country. That is for Ukraine and its leaders, its parliament, and its people to decide. And yet we have codified, the West has codified in the Minsk agreement, the Minsk ceasefire agreement, that Russia can decide whether Ukraine has met the standards or not. That's absurd. So I would favor ripping the thing up, starting over, inserting the United States into a leadership role that it should take, and pushing back on the aggressor, the guilty party here, which is Russia, not Ukraine. The narrative these days, and all of us have been to Europe recently, I've been there too many times in the past few months, the narrative has completely shifted, and this is really unfortunate. The narrative is the Russian narrative that far too many Europeans are adopting, which is failure of Minsk is the fault of Ukraine, not Russia. We have to change that narrative. We have to correct it, because the fault of Minsk lies in Moscow, not
David,
Kiev.
say a word about the referendum that is going to be held next week in the Netherlands.
It's non-binding, and yet it's incredibly important. The Labour Party, which is part of the Dutch coalition, has said that it will feel bound by the result of the referendum. This is basically a thumbs up or thumbs down on the EU's deep and comprehensive free trade and association agreement with Ukraine. And there's a threshold of 30% turnout that's necessary, and it will be a huge victory. I sounded like Donald Trump just then. It'll be a big victory, God forbid. A big victory for Putin if the Dutch vote that down.
It looks like the polls show that the Dutch are going to vote.
Which is hard to imagine, given that they would hand a victory to the side that killed 190.
Well, what's
of their
behind
citizens.
the referendum? I mean, there's this website, Gensteel, I think it was called. I mean, is Russia propaganda behind that? Are they whipping something up to have a referendum like that in the Netherlands?
I don't know if they whipped up the referendum, but they're certainly involved in it. And I do think Ukrainian officials need to be more aggressive in getting involved in making clear to Dutch citizens what's at stake here.
Right.
This is critically important, and I share your nervousness.
1 week from today. 1 week from today. Tamari?
Look, I mentioned that both are dead but unburied. So people still talk about these agreements. So that means that they are unburied. I cannot imagine any Ukrainian leader implementing what is written there. It will be a political suicide for sure, if not other forms of suicide. I am not in a position to criticize Poroshenko for accepting it, because probably in that situation when the US was gone or non-present and the Europeans were holding basically gun on his head and Russians were holding the gun literally, that probably was the only choice, with the hope that Russians will be the ones who will violate. So in that sense, it was the right calculations. So I don't know how many more evidences Europeans or Americans or anybody else needs that Russia is not fulfilling. So what is surprising in this Bild article? For me, nothing. I mean, we know it. Go into American departments of whatever department you go to who deals with Ukraine. They know that Russians are behind everything. They know that there are no separatists. They know that these are controlled by Russia, by people parachuted from Russia, supplied by Russia, armed by Russia, and they are not even proxies, they are Russians. So whom we are fooling? Ourselves or media? Or I don't understand. Every single European leader knows it. American leadership knows it. OSCE is documenting almost every day that it's violated. Where is the problem? Problem is that nobody had an appetite to act upon these violations. It's not that we don't know what is happening. We know, but we are in a mode to self-impose blindness or something like that. Yes, it takes leadership. We don't have a for whatever reasons, leadership who is going to challenge Russia. Who is challenging Russia? People of Ukraine. And nobody else.
Well,
Probably some crazy Georgians, that's it.
Let-
But the fact on the ground is, and the unfortunate fact on the ground is that European businesses want to lift sanctions, European leaders want to lift sanctions, Dutch referendum, the Russia TV, all of these kind of things have one source, and nobody wants to address that source seriously.
Well, there is one person, certainly, who is prepared to stand up to Russia, and it's quite remarkable, and that is somebody that David has already mentioned, Nadia Savchenko. And I just want to read the statement that this is from The Economist, by the way, quite a remarkable report on her trial, where she said, "I accept neither guilt nor the verdict, nor the Russian court. I want the whole democratic, civilized world to realize that Russia is a third world country with a totalitarian regime and a petty tyrant dictator where human rights and international law are spat upon." And then she leaped onto the bench. This is a woman in prison, about to be sentenced, leaped onto the bench inside a cage and showed her middle finger to the court's 3 judges. And she finished off by singing the Ukrainian national anthem. What does this mean for Ukraine? I'm just, somebody has emerged right here, a kind of a Joan of Arc. What does it mean for Ukraine?
I think she's become a very important symbol, a symbol of resistance, defiance, tremendous courage. She didn't expect to be in this situation. She has become a member of the Rada, I think also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, since she was kidnapped, and she was kidnapped from Ukrainian territory. She was taken before the 2 Russian journalists were killed. The evidence on that is crystal clear. And she has demonstrated by example on an individual basis how to stand up to the egregious behavior of Russian officials, the abuse of the court system, the ignoring fellow countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. She's been a great inspiration, I think. And in my view, she can't get back to Kiev fast enough.
And then what happens when she does, because she's a national hero? Murray?
As we all know, defiance is the highest form of patriotism, as one of your presidents said once. So Nadia Savchenko, besides being a symbol of defiance, is also a symbol for the free world. And if she continues to stay in jail, in Russian jail, this is embarrassment of the free world and the leaders of the free world. As long as she remains there, there is an embarrassment. So if the free world was advocating for people, Mandela and others, rightly so, though unlike Nadia Savchenko, Mandela was decorated by order of Lenin. And this woman was just defending her country. And every single moment that she spent in the jail, this should be embarrassment of the free world that is not doing enough to free her.
Let's just turn as a kind of a final subject to Russia and Putin, because there is concern that Russia, having committed aggression against Ukraine and then turned its attention to Syria, might now turn its attention back to Ukraine. The question is, is that possible, and why might that be so? I think, as we all know, Russia is in the midst of a very, very deep economic crisis, a crisis in which salaries have been cut in half in a year. There was an economic contraction by 4% last year. There's the sharp drop in oil prices by 3/4, the sanctions, which are sharpening the crisis. And there are polls showing that since October, the percentage of Russians who think that the country is moving in the right direction has dropped from about 60% to about 50%, but it's the direction there which is important. And I was at a meeting with a U.S. official just 10 days ago who said that Putin obsessively watches films of Gaddafi's fall, and he's paranoid about a colored revolution in Russia. All that's pretty interesting. And I say that to sort of, why this military action? What are his objectives? And is it possible that really what Putin wants in attacking Syria and attacking Ukraine is to have videos on the television to show that he's a national hero fighting the evil empire. And that's the only way he can shore up his own popularity and legitimacy in this kind of period, a kind of patriotic mobilization being a substitute for democratic legitimacy. Are you worried about Putin in these circumstances actually renewing the aggressive, more aggressive offensive against Ukraine?
I'm not just worried about that. I'm worried about many things that he would do. Putin has three goals: staying in power at any cost, staying in power at any cost, and staying in power at any cost. He will do whatever is necessary to stay in power. He oversees an enormously corrupt kleptocratic system, and the more corrupt it becomes, the more authoritarian it becomes. The more he has to resort to desperate measures to stay in power. That is his overriding objective. Certainly the color revolutions starting in 2003 in Georgia, 2004 in Ukraine scared him. The Arab movements in 2011 renewed his paranoia. Looking at Assad, probably the closest ally he had in the Middle East, on the brink of collapse last summer is why he went into Syria, as well as the vacuum that we left by not doing anything. But by far the biggest point of concern for him is Ukraine. The Maidan movement, which was so tremendously inspirational, was viewed by Putin as a threat to what he has built up in his own country. If it could happen in Ukraine, he worried it could happen in Russia. Think back to the protests after the December 2011 Duma elections, where you had really sizable turnouts and crowds in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and elsewhere, continuing into March and May 2012. That too scared Putin. And then he sees Ukraine, where the people demanded an end to corrupt government, demanded dignity, demanded a deeper integration with Europe and the West. And all of those things are anathema to Putin. Any country that tries to liberalize, democratize, integrate more with the West is a threat. That started with Georgia in 2008. Actually, it started with Estonia with a cyber attack in 2007 and continued with Ukraine. His goal, I don't think, is to take over Ukraine. It's to destabilize it, to make it unappealing and unattractive so that the West loses interest, which is, if you think about it, very contrary to Russia's national interest. Putin does not pursue Russian national interests. He pursues his own interests, and those often conflict with his countries.
So, Murray, what does it mean for Russia if Ukraine does succeed?
It will be a super good for Russia, if you ask me. If Ukraine succeeds, we will see reformed Russia, we will see more democratic Russia, we will see a normal partner that all of us neighboring Russia aspire to have a reliable, democratic, sovereign Russia, strong Russia, that is not invading its neighbors, but is trading with its neighborhood. I think Putin should be worried because why he's watching Gaddafi and others. Because these revolutions showed something very important. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You can have hundreds of billions of dollars. And Gaddafi and Mubarak and others had a lot of money. Yanukovych had a lot of money. It's not helping you. At a certain moment, black swan events may happen and you are done. So you can call it colorful revolutions, whatever you can call it. The problem with these autocratic regimes is that they're very fragile. So it's not the system in a democratic country. You have to win something, you may lose, you have to convince ideas, this and that. These are very rigid systems. These are basically the card houses. And of course he should be scared, because he is not, you never know where the blow will come from. In democratic system, you know. I mean, there is an open opposition who is openly criticizing you. But in a system like Putin has built, it's unknown where the disaster will come and when. So he is scared. Putin drastically failed to reform Russia as a modern nation. He started to understand that made a huge mistake by alienating Ukraine. And today we talk about completely different nation. It's not about East and West, you know, some more nationalistic West and more pro-Russian East. No, we are not talking about it anymore. He alienated entire Ukrainian nation and people of Ukraine. And whatever fabrications he's producing in his TV, he knows very well that it's all fabrication, and it's a big, big lie. For Putin, success of countries like Ukraine means not only end of his regime, but also end of his fantasies and ideas what Russia should be. He never, in my opinion, accepted Russian Federation as a country that he has to govern or rule. He always thought that it should be something bigger. So they were playing with ideas of, I don't know, the Eurasian Union, customs union, this kind of union, liberal something, you know, empires, and et cetera, and et cetera. There are historic reasons for that. I don't want to go into details. But the problem is that today Russia is still in the identity crisis. If you go to Russia and ask who you are, they don't know. They will show you this colored beetle ribbon or whatever, but when you say, okay, and what, and who are you? We are the great Russians, which means what? That you have a super rich thief as a leader or what? So changing Ukraine, and people here and in Europe should understand, is the only way to change Russia. Democratic Ukraine is a prerequisite to get democratic Russia, and not vice versa.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Tamori touched on this, and you did a little bit too, Carl, the issue of sanctions. This summer, the European Union will review its sanctions policy against Russia, and as Tamori indicated, there is a lot of talk about getting back to business as usual. You've had the Vice Chancellor of Germany, Sigmund Gabriel, saying it's time to get back to business as usual with Russia, enough of these sanctions. You have Marine Le Pen and Sarkozy and others in France. These are critical players in these countries. To me, it would be unconscionable to lift sanctions against Russia, since it has not done a damn thing on Minsk. And the United States needs to lead the way. It needs to make it clear to Europe that maintaining these sanctions is the least we should do. There is no talk anymore about ratcheting up sanctions. The best we can hope for is maintenance of existing sanctions. That is not good enough. We have to ratchet up sanctions every time Putin continues to violate Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and continue this until Russia bends. I'm not interested in finding an off-ramp for Mr. Putin. I'm interested in getting him out of Ukraine and having him respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of his neighbors.
You know, and I'm going to recognize the question in 1 minute, but let me just complete a thought and a point that Tamori was making about Ukraine's importance to the struggle for democracy in Russia. There's a tendency in this town to assume that there are no Russian Democrats, that it's hopeless. And I just want to note that on Friday, there was an advertisement before about the Atlantic Council and Anders Östlund, but David and I are going to take our act to the Atlantic Council, where we're going to be with the daughter of Boris Nemtsov, talking about the investigation into his murder, along with Vladimir Karamurza, a young man who spoke in the Congress at a forum we had less than a year ago, and just 3 weeks after the forum in the Congress, he was poisoned in Russia. He was given 5% chance to live, and he survived. And he's going back to Russia now to work. I mean, talk about courage. Talk about courage. And let us just say that all of us have a stake, not just in, you know, a clear and more forceful policy from the West, but also in supporting these incredibly heroic people who are really putting their lives on the line. There's we had last week in Washington, Ilya Yashin. He was very close to Nemtsov, and he just produced a report called A Threat to National Security. And it's about Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the terrorist thug that Putin has appointed head of Chechnya, and who, you know, even the FSB is afraid of this guy. And Yashin is saying, with his 30,000 troops, Kadyrov could really threaten the very security of Russia from within. And he said he might resign. He was sort of egging Putin on, who's under pressure from the FSB, to endorse his staying as president to Putin. And then just last week, Putin said he wanted him to stay. I mean, it should never be forgotten, you know, when the U.S. is working with Russia, that the leader of Russia is allied to a murderous thug. It was Kadyrov who killed Nemtsov. It was Kadyrov who killed Anna Politkovskaya. It was Kadyrov who killed Natasha Estemirova. And all of us have a stake in these, in the survival of the people in Russia who are fighting against that for freedom. And I just think Yashin's issuing this report and being in Russia is another act of extraordinary courage. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Svetlana Khutka. I am Fulbright Scholar and visiting associate professor at Stanford University. And my question is as follows. In 70s, Mark von Hagen, a very famous historian, he wrote an interesting essay, Does Ukraine Exist? Actually, it was about the blindness of the USA academic science to the existence of Ukraine. Mainly it was analyzed through the lenses of Russian Empire history. Several weeks ago, I had a possibility to discuss Ukrainian situation with Minister of Defense of Germany. And she recognized that it took them a year to understand that actually it was not fascism or nationalism in Ukraine, how they perceived that, but Russian propaganda about what's happened in Ukraine. And we know that still in 90s, after, for example, this, we had Kievan Chicken Bush speech in Kiev. Still we have quite complicated trial to understand what's going on in Ukraine, again, under umbrella of Russian and USA American relationships. There is no Ukrainian studies in USA, while there is a network of centers for Russian and East European studies which are financed by federal government. While there is no job vacancies, there is no scholarship for Ukrainian studies which would present contemporary situation in Ukraine taken by people from the ground. So my question is as follows. What might be done at this level? You represent think tanks, and there is a lot of people in this audience who actually promoting real Ukrainian agenda. So my question is, what might be done now at real level of support of real Ukrainian studies to present what is going on in Ukraine by Ukrainian scientists from Ukrainian point of view, not through the lens of Russian Empire history, Soviet legacy, and so on. Thank you.
That's terrific. And let me just say a brief word. A lot of you may know Ann Applebaum, who I'm proud to say has just joined the board of my organization, the National Endowment for Democracy, and she's working on a book about Ukraine. And she has a review in the current issue of the New Yorker Review of Books about a new history of Ukraine and going back and showing how the nation developed. And she writes in this review that Ukraine's right to exist is still routinely questioned in Western capitals, which I think is exactly what you're saying, that it's not known that, that Ukraine is a real nation. And it's questioned repeatedly. I think it's been questioned by American leaders as well. And there's also this acceptance of this idea of a sphere of influence, and really questioning our fundamental principles of democracy and national sovereignty. It's possible, if there's any silver lining in the dark, dark cloud of what's happening today, is that the aggression by Russia is really, and sometimes it's in struggle, is going to create a stronger Ukrainian nation. That's my great hope. And I've seen that in Ukraine, people coming together, minority groups and so forth, feeling that now they're Ukrainians defending their country against a foreign aggression. Well, as a moderator, I wanted to say something. So, David.
Just very quickly, 2 points. One, there are some universities that have this. Harvard, of course, has probably the leading Ukrainian center. But the other point I would make is, for all of you presumably are constituents. And one way to gin up more federal funding for this kind of research and study is to contact your senators and congressmen, women as well. And they presumably will listen. Whether they can bring about results, who knows. But if you don't push from the grassroots for more federal support for this, then it won't happen.
You know, you may not like my answer, but you have more Russian studies because Russians have nuclear bombs. You have more Russian studies because everything else around Russia was considered as Russia, so the Russian studies were kind of supposed to cover everything else. You have a Russian studies and non-Ukrainian studies because Russians have a larger megaphone. But what Russians do not have here is the pro-Russian diaspora. And you have a pro-Ukrainian diaspora. And why a pro-Ukrainian diaspora is not organizing, funding, and supporting Ukrainian study centers in different US universities. Why Ukrainian oligarchs are not funding. I know so many of them that spend millions and tens of millions of dollars with the PR companies that do nothing for them. And this is more than enough money to establish one endowment that can fund Ukrainian studies. And now you have a momentum. Finally, Americans discovered Ukraine. Finally, they understood that this is a different country and different nation. Not everybody, but most of Americans. And this is a momentum now to jump on the boat and promote your country, your culture, your nation, because there is a window, and this window of opportunity will not stay long.
Thank you very much. No time now. You could talk to the panelists later. Thank you very much for your insights and the food for thought.